Boy, this is gonna get ugly real quick. Hey.
There's a strange contradiction at the center of Michael Biehn's story. He was there at the exact moment Hollywood reinvented the modern action hero. He stood face to face with a machine that would redefine science fiction. He survived futures that looked burned out, militarized, and hopeless. And yet, when the genre he helped shape became the most profitable machine in the industry, he was quietly left behind. This is not the story of an actor who was never good enough. That explanation doesn't hold. The camera loved him too much for that. Neither is it the story of a single scandal or catastrophic failure. There was no public implosion, no tabloid spectacle, no definitive moment where the world turned its back. Instead, the mystery is quieter and more uncomfortable. How does someone become essential to the DNA of Hollywood blockbusters and still end up marginal to the system that benefited from them? How does an actor embody competence, moral gravity, and emotional restraint only to discover that those very traits are no longer wanted once the industry changes its appetite? Michael Biehn didn't burn out in a blaze of excess the way so many of his contemporaries did. He didn't disappear overnight. He simply faded from the center of the frame, while the industry moved on without ever quite acknowledging what it had taken from him first. This story isn't about what he lost. It's about what Hollywood no longer knew how to use. If you're drawn to these kinds of quiet Hollywood mystery stories that live between success and disappearance, you're invited to subscribe to the Final Cut Stories, where long-form cinematic retrospectives take their time and let the truth surface slowly. Because with Michael Biehn, the real question isn't why he failed to become a superstar. It's why someone so perfectly suited to a certain idea of heroism became incompatible with the one that replaced it. Long before the pressure of studios and box office expectations, Michael Biehn's personality was already forming far from Hollywood's machinery. He grew up in environments defined by movement rather than roots. His family relocated frequently following work rather than stability, and that constant shifting left him adaptable, observant, and quietly self-contained. There was no inherited sense that the world would make space for him. No assumption that attention was guaranteed. Instead, there was an early understanding that you learn the rules of each new environment quickly or you fell behind. As a young man, his interests were not centered on performance or validation. Athletics, particularly basketball, gave him structure and identity. The appeal wasn't spectacle. It was discipline, repetition, precision, the satisfaction of doing a job well, even when no one was watching closely. Those instincts would later define his screen presence far more than any formal acting technique. When acting eventually entered his life, it didn't arrive as a dream of fame. It arrived as a craft, something to study, something to control. He trained seriously, treating performance as a technical discipline rather than an emotional exhibition. He learned how to listen on camera, how to underplay rather than announce, how to let tension live beneath stillness. That restraint became part of his psychology. He was not naturally inclined toward self-promotion. He didn't project hunger for celebrity. Even early on, there was a sense that he was more comfortable inside the work than selling the work, more interested in credibility than charisma, even though he possessed both. But this also planted a subtle vulnerability. Hollywood rewards people who understand not just how to perform, but how to demand space. Biehn's instinct was the opposite. He trusted that if the work was solid, the system would respond accordingly. He believed, perhaps naively, that professionalism and consistency were currencies that held long-term value. That belief would serve him extraordinarily well at first, and quietly betray him later. Because while his inner framework prepared him to embody soldiers, survivors, and men under pressure, it did not prepare him for an industry that would eventually value image over interior life, volume over restraint, and spectacle over quiet authority. The foundation was solid, but it was built for a version of Hollywood that would not last. Michael Biehn didn't arrive in Hollywood with momentum. He arrived with timing. When he stepped into the role of Kyle Reese in the Terminator, the industry was still defining what an action lead was supposed to be. Muscles dominated the frame. Dialogue was secondary to physical presence. Vulnerability, if it existed at all, was buried under spectacle. Biehn broke that pattern quietly. Kyle Reese wasn't invincible. He wasn't dominant. He was exhausted, traumatized, and already half living in the aftermath of a war that hadn't happened yet. What Biehn brought to the role wasn't brute force, it was urgency and moral gravity. He played a man who knew the future and carried its weight in his posture. His eyes, his voice. The performance suggested intelligence under pressure rather than domination over it, Hollywood noticed. Not just the audience, but the filmmakers who understood what had just happened. One of them was James Cameron, who recognized that Biehn represented a different kind of masculine credibility. He wasn't loud. He didn't posture. He felt real in situations that were fundamentally unreal. That credibility carried over into Aliens, where Biehn's Corporal Hicks became something rare in blockbuster cinema, a calm center. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but when he spoke, people listened. His authority wasn't imposed, it was earned. The performance reinforced a specific image of Michael Biehn that Hollywood quickly embraced. He became the thinking action hero, the soldier with restraint, the leader who didn't need to dominate the frame to control it. The man audiences trusted when things fell apart. From the outside, this looked like the beginning of something inevitable. A career built on longevity, on serious leading roles, on a steady climb toward the upper tier of Hollywood stardom. But embedded in that promise was a quiet limitation. The industry wasn't seeing Michael Biehn in full, it was seeing a version of him. A specific utility, a certain kind of credibility that worked beautifully within tightly defined parameters. And while those roles made him indispensable to certain films, they also fixed him in place. He was being admired, but he was also being categorized. Hollywood believed it had discovered exactly who Michael Biehn was, and in doing so, it began closing off who he was allowed to become. Success didn't expand Michael Biehn's range in the eyes of the industry, it narrowed it. By the late 1980s, Hollywood had quietly assigned him a function. He was the reliable professional, the soldier, the man you cast when you needed credibility under fire but didn't want chaos on set or ego in the frame. He brought discipline, restraint, and emotional weight. But those same qualities made him easy to define and, eventually, easy to limit. When he stepped into the role of Lieutenant Coffee in The Abyss, the shift should have signaled evolution. Instead of a protector, he played a man unraveling under pressure. Paranoia replaced control. Authority curdled into obsession. It was one of his most complex performances, unsettling precisely because it subverted everything audiences thought they knew about him. But Hollywood didn't follow that signal. The industry rarely rewards actors for complicating their image unless it's commercially convenient. In Biehn's case, the performance didn't open doors, it confused them. He no longer fit neatly into the heroic mold that had been assigned to him, but he wasn't being offered the psychological leads that might have allowed him to redefine himself either. At the same time, the action genre itself was changing. The late 80s and early 90s began favoring scale over intimacy. Bigger bodies, bigger explosions, simpler emotional architecture. The thinking soldier, the quiet professional, was becoming less visible in a marketplace that wanted spectacle first and reflection later. This placed Biehn in a tightening box. He wasn't large enough to compete with the new mythic physiques. He wasn't eccentric enough to pivot into character acting overnight, and he wasn't inclined to reinvent himself publicly or aggressively pursue reinvention behind the scenes. Control began slipping not through conflict but through inertia. Roles became variations rather than progressions. Expectations hardened. Casting decisions became safer, narrower, more repetitive. And because Biehn's professionalism made him dependable, it also made him replaceable in an industry that increasingly prioritized novelty over consistency. The pressure wasn't explosive, it was suffocating. And while audiences still recognized his face and trusted his presence, Hollywood had already started looking past him without ever fully admitting it. The box had been built quietly, and by the time its walls were visible, it was already difficult to step outside them. There was no single headline announcing the moment Michael Biehn's trajectory changed, no public collapse, no defining scandal, no dramatic exit. Instead, the turning point arrived as a convergence subtle, cumulative, and largely invisible from the outside. By the early 1990s, the gap between who Biehn was as an actor and what the industry wanted him to be had widened. The roles he was offered no longer challenged him psychologically, yet stepping away from them carried its own risks. At the same time, the internal pressure of staying relevant inside a system that no longer knew where to place him began to take its toll. This was when alcohol stopped being social and started becoming functional. By his own later admissions, drinking became a way to manage anxiety, frustration, and the quiet erosion of control over his career. Hollywood is forgiving of excess when success is still accelerating. It is far less patient when momentum slows. What might have been overlooked earlier now began to reframe how he was perceived less as a dependable professional, more as a potential risk. The irony is that Biehn never stopped being talented, but perception matters more than truth in an industry built on insurance, schedules, and predictability. Once doubt enters the equation, casting decisions shift quickly. The phone rings less often. Meetings become vague. Opportunities evaporate without explanation. Even collaborations that once felt secure no longer materialized. The system didn't punish him. It simply stopped prioritizing him. This is the part of the story that resists easy blame. Alcohol was not the cause of everything that followed, but it magnified existing vulnerabilities at the exact moment the industry was already moving on. The combination was decisive. A career built on trust began to erode, not because of a single failure, but because the margin for error had quietly disappeared. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It was bureaucratic, and once the industry's attention shifted elsewhere, reclaiming that ground became nearly impossible, no matter how capable he still was. After the shift, nothing collapsed all at once. The work didn't stop, but it changed shape. Michael Biehn was no longer orbiting the center of major studio projects. The roles became smaller, the budgets leaner, the visibility reduced. He moved into genre films, independent productions, and supporting parts that relied on his credibility rather than his star power. To an outside observer, it might have looked like a fall. From the inside, it felt more like a narrowing corridor. He still delivered strong performances. In Tombstone, his Johnny Ringo carried menace, intelligence, and fatalism, an echo of the complexity he had always brought to the screen. But even that performance existed at the edge of a system that no longer revolved around him. What followed was not exile, but repositioning. As the studio machine grew less interested, Biehn adjusted without protest. He worked steadily rather than strategically. He accepted roles that allowed him to stay active, to stay inside the craft, even if they didn't come with prestige or visibility. For an actor whose identity had never been tied purely to celebrity, this mattered more than maintaining status. At the same time, personal priorities began to shift. Sobriety became a necessary recalibration rather than a public redemption narrative. Health concerns emerged later, including a serious stroke that affected coordination and balance. Another reminder that time imposes limits no career can negotiate with forever. Still, he continued working when possible, adapting again rather than retreating. When he appeared years later in The Mandalorian, audiences recognized him instantly. The voice, the posture, the authority. It was a brief return to familiar terrain, and the reaction revealed something telling. The respect had never disappeared, only the spotlight had. The aftermath of Michael Biehn's turning point was not defined by bitterness or retreat. It was defined by endurance, by staying present without demanding restoration, by working without insisting on relevance, by allowing his career to become quieter without pretending it hadn't changed. This was not a comeback story. It was something slower, more honest, and harder to dramatize. A life adjusting to reality rather than resisting it. At a certain point, the question stopped being whether Michael Biehn would return to the center of Hollywood. It became whether the center was worth returning to at all. As the years passed, his relationship with acting subtly transformed. The urgency that once accompanied career momentum was replaced by something steadier. He no longer needed roles to validate his identity, and he no longer measured success by proximity to studio power or cultural dominance. acting became what it may have always been for him at its core, a craft, not a competition. He gravitated toward projects where control mattered more than exposure. Independent films, genre stories that embraced imperfection, work that allowed him to participate fully rather than perform within rigid expectations. In some cases, he stepped behind the camera, directing and producing alongside his wife, not as a reinvention strategy, but as a way to stay creatively engaged on his own terms. This shift wasn't framed publicly as reinvention because it didn't need to be. There was no attempt to rebrand, no narrative of reclaiming relevance, no insistence that the industry had made a mistake. Instead, there was acceptance, measured, unsentimental, and quietly confident. Biehn never disowned his earlier career, but he stopped chasing its echo. He understood something many actors struggle to accept, that being useful to Hollywood is not the same as being fulfilled by the work. Once that distinction became clear, the pressure lifted. The roles he chose no longer had to prove anything. In this phase of his life, success was defined by sustainability, by staying sober, by staying curious, by staying connected to the work without needing the work to carry him. It wasn't a redemption arc because there was no grand moral correction being performed. It was a recalibration one that acknowledged loss without being consumed by it and experience without turning it into nostalgia. Michael Biehn didn't reinvent himself to survive. He reduced the noise until what remained still mattered. Michael Biehn's story resists the clean lines Hollywood prefers. There is no rise and fall symmetry, no triumphant return that restores balance. What remains instead is a quieter truth about how the industry treats people who arrive at exactly the right moment, and then outlive that moment. He helped define a version of the modern action hero that valued intelligence over bravado, restraint over spectacle, and emotional weight over physical dominance. But as the industry evolved, it moved toward a louder, more exaggerated form of heroism, one that left little room for his particular kind of presence. The shift wasn't personal, it was structural, and structure doesn't apologize. Biehn's legacy isn't measured by box office totals or franchise ownership. It lives in influence, in performances that still feel grounded decades later, in characters who behave like real people inside unreal worlds, in a certain kind of cinematic masculinity that now feels almost endangered, competent, vulnerable, and quietly ethical. Perhaps the deeper meaning of his journey isn't about being forgotten. It's about what gets remembered. Hollywood remembers scale. It remembers spectacle. It remembers noise, but it often forgets the people who made those things believable in the first place, the actors who carried the emotional weight while the machinery expanded around them. Michael Biehn never disappeared. The system simply stopped looking for what he represented. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of this story. Not that a talented actor drifted from the spotlight, but that an entire industry evolved away from the values he embodied, without ever fully acknowledging what it lost in the process. If this story resonated with you, you're invited to share your thoughts about Michael Biehn, about the films that stayed with you, or about the kind of performances Hollywood no longer makes space for. Some legacies don't demand attention. They wait patiently until someone remembers how to look.